So as it turns out, I have quite a bit to say. So I think what's best in terms of time is if I just jump right in. Um, so look, I mean, you all probably get from the title of the book that the book is about generally about online crime and particularly scams. And a number of people have asked me in recent months what prompted me to research and write this book. And the answer to that question is I always just say, how much time do you have? Because I can tell you why I decided to write this book, but it's a very long explanation. So I'm not going to start today by talking about what made me write this book. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what's in the book. And then by the end of that explanation, hopefully you will see that my reasons for researching it and writing it are quite obvious. But I'll start with a bit of a disclaimer. And my disclaimer comes in the form of an apology. And that is this. I'm going to apologize in advance because if the internet is something that you use to organize your life or to make things a little bit more fun or to do a little bit of online shopping or whatever, I'm sorry because I'm about to ruin the internet for you. So let me just apologize in advance. I'm going to take a few minutes now to talk about scams. And when I say that, as soon as I say that, I know that a lot of you are inwardly saying to yourselves, oh, yeah, scams are terrible. But hey, at least that's got nothing to do with me because I'm not dumb enough to fall for a scam. Because, of course, when we hear that word scam, right, we usually think of your stock standard social engineering scams like 419 email scams or romance scams or whatever. Fake investment scams, pig butchering scams, crypto ROM scams. And those are all scenarios where scammers actually have to do quite a lot of work to convince you to fall for a ruse. And so, unless it's actually happened to you, a lot of us just think, oh, well, it doesn't apply to us because, again, I'm not stupid enough to fall for a scam. Well, have you ever been on holiday? Have you ever traveled for work? Have you ever booked a hotel room or a self-catering apartment online? Have you ever thought about buying a house and then browsed on Property 24, any real estate website looking for houses to buy or even for a place to rent? Have you ever bought something online, like on Amazon or Takealot? Or have you ever booked a ride on a ride-hailing app like Uber or Bolt? Now, if you've done any one of those things, it means that you are highly susceptible to falling victim to a scam. And don't worry, it's not because you're stupid. It's just because you are trusting. So let me tell you what I mean by that. So for example, you trust that platforms like Booking.com and Airbnb have verified the properties that they've listed on their sites. You trust that companies like Uber and Bolt have verified the driver's licenses and the criminal clearance records of their vehicle operators. But have you ever asked yourself, why do you trust that these companies have verified these things? Take a second and think about it. Why do you trust that these big tech companies have properly verified the services that they offer on their sites? Why? Why do you trust that? Well, I'm here to tell you that your trust is misplaced. Because what these companies won't tell you is that their verification protocols are at best extremely dodgy and at worst completely mythological. And of course, they won't tell us that because if they did, they would be out of business. It's just not in the best financial interests of the big tech barons to honestly disclose the susceptibility of their platforms to criminal activity. And as I'm going to explain later, it's also not in their financial interest to make their platforms safer. Basically, big tech profits when crime happens on their platforms. I'll say that again so that it can sink in. Big tech profits when crime happens on their platforms. But we'll get into the details of that later. I'm just going to start with a few examples of the types of crimes that are initiated on sharing economy platforms so that you can get an idea of what it is that I'm talking about. I think it's important to realize that scammers will maneuver wherever they can find space to do so. So that means that scams appear on sharing economy platforms, is true, but also on many other digital spaces. Like if you think about Tinder or Grindr, Booking.com, Hotels.com, video sharing sites like YouTube, and then also social networks like Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. So in my book, what I did was, and knowing that, what I did in my book was I included a general overview, or sort of bird's eye view, or a summary of various different big tech platforms and examples of the dangerous criminal activity that actually appears there. And I only selected a few platforms as examples, but there are literally thousands of examples. And I did that because I'm trying to be very careful that I don't want to create the mistaken impression that digital scamming is a problem that belongs only to the larger sharing economy platforms like Uber or Airbnb. Scams are everywhere online. So in the book, I did take a brief look at, for example, one example was the online fake pet selling scams that bloomed in the early days of the COVID pandemic in Australia. It was completely unbelievable. The Australian Consumer Body reported that pet-related scams increased by over 1,000% in 2020, with gross losses topping at 4.2 million Australian dollars. I've talked about pig butchering and romance scams, and here the eventual targets aren't only the victims of the scam, because criminal syndicates use scam tactics by posting fake job advertisements, luring work seekers into human trafficking, where they are then used as slaves and then forced into perpetuating romance scams at scale. So we're talking about a massive and highly organized criminal industry, which is quite scary. And I gave quite a bit of attention to an app that many of us love and use quite often, which is Uber. But did you know that a sexual assault and rape epidemic in the United States was caused by Uber driver impersonation scams from 2021 onwards, resulting in the rape, sexual assault, murder, and harassment of almost 4,000 women in that country per year? And on the home front, we have seen, and you've seen reports of this in the newspaper, how Facebook marketplace scams often end in fraud, armed robberies, and murders. So these are the types of scams and crimes I'm talking about. They originate online via sharing economy or similar platforms, and they involve some form of deceptive communication at the moment of initial contact with the target. Now, for my book, what I decided to do would be an in-depth case study of one specific sharing economy platform. And I did that in order to give myself the space to really do a deep dive into the cogs and the machinery of the platform so that I could figure out what made the site susceptible to misuse by scammers. And I chose Airbnb. So why did I choose Airbnb? Well, for three critical reasons. And the first reason is that accommodation sharing presents uniquely high safety risks compared to other platforms. When you're booking accommodation via a sharing economy platform, the exchange involves the expectation that you will physically occupy the private home space of an individual that is a complete stranger to you. Your presence in this space lasts for a relatively long time and is secluded from public view. And you are present in the space at the time of the day when you are at your most vulnerable. That is when you are sleeping. So the physical risk factor with accommodation sharing is just much higher than what we see on other sharing economy platforms. Secondly, accommodation platforms involve substantially higher financial stakes than most other sharing economy services. So you're not just paying a few bucks for an Uber ride here. It's expensive to book accommodation. It's a large sum of money. But this makes accommodation sharing platforms highly attractive to scammers because obviously they're seeking the most lucrative targets. And then thirdly, Airbnb just dominates in terms of the accommodation sharing market by an enormous margin. By 2022, it hosted 6.6 million active listings in 100,000 cities with 1.4 billion guest arrivals. So it's a clear industry leader in terms of scale and is actually bigger than the top 5 hotel brands combined. So for my analysis for scam activity and crime activity on Airbnb, I adopted a qualitative ethnographic thematic content analysis of user-generated content, and I assessed 602 cases of unique scam and crime events that were facilitated via the Airbnb platform. So, after doing all of that, what types of crimes and scams do we see on Airbnb? Well, sadly, there are many. Probably the one that most people would be familiar with is the phantom listing scam. So that's where a property that's advertised on the platform is entirely fictional. So the scammer will construct a fake, attractive-looking Airbnb listing and then accepts payments from unsuspecting guests. And it's only when the guest arrives at the address that they discover that the property actually doesn't exist. So now we have guests that first have lost a large sum of money. Second, these people are left stranded, often in a foreign location with nowhere else to go. And thirdly, they may not be able to secure a refund for reasons that I'll explain later, or they may not have a budget of additional funds to book emergency accommodation. So I've literally assessed multiple cases where guests that this has happened to have been forced to sleep on the street in foreign cities. And yes, this does include academics traveling to overseas conferences, just by the way. Bait and switch scams are also very prevalent. So here, the host switches the guest from the original property to an alternative property. Is not as serious as the phantom listing scam, but it's still a scam because the guest then pays for a premium listing, but stays in a rental that is often unsafe, unclean, or missing in crucial amenities or just in an unsafe location. Scammers also list properties in locations where it is illegal to do so, meaning that guests are often evicted by local authorities. Once again, they're rendered homeless. Or scammers simply create listings of other people's homes without the knowledge or the permission of the owner of the property. And then Airbnb guests then turn up on the doorstep of very confused homeowners to find out they've been scammed. Scammers can also, and this is quite sophisticated, but scammers can also redirect guests away from the secure Airbnb payment portal to alternate payment methods by setting up mock Airbnb lookalike sites that look exactly the same as Airbnb. So those are the types of scams we see on Airbnb. And right now, I know what you're all thinking. You're saying to yourselves, well, why don't people just read the reviews? Because that's what we're told to do, right? Before you buy something online, before you book a property, you read the reviews of other people who have booked that same property or bought that same product online. So sure, it's good advice. And Airbnb does have a review mechanism, but scammers have learned a way to navigate around that review mechanism. So by jumping through a bunch of technical loopholes, they can actually publish fake, glowingly positive reviews from former guests of fictional properties that don't exist. So, which means that you can actually fall for a scam on Airbnb even if you read the reviews, because the reviews themselves are fake. The danger associated with Airbnb, though, isn't just isolated to financial crime, because it also acts as a catalyst for physical crimes. The business model is premised on staying in a stranger's private property, right? So criminal hosts use the platform to lure targets who are guests into dangerous environments. So once checked in, the guest is isolated. I've assessed multiple cases where Airbnb guests were extorted, assaulted, robbed with no signs of forced entry, raped, murdered, made victims of sexploitation or human trafficking, or held hostage, all after they had checked into what they thought was a legitimate Airbnb booking. When we think about Airbnb, we generally think about an accommodation booking platform, but that is not what it is. In my case study, I treated Airbnb actually as a mass communications platform, similar to social networks like Facebook or Twitter, X, or TikTok. So when we look at social media, we recognize that these big social networks are entirely populated by user-generated content. And of course, we know now that in amongst that user-generated content, there's quite a lot of disinformation. We know that. But when you think about it, Airbnb is also entirely populated by user-generated content. The property listings aren't created by Airbnb. They are generated by the hosts, who are sometimes scammers. And the guest reviews of properties are also posted by users, who are sometimes review fakers. So essentially, Airbnb is then more like a social network because all of the content that you see on the platform is user-generated. It's just a social network with a focus on advertising accommodation. But if we already know that disinformation appears frequently on other social networks, it shouldn't come as a surprise then when disinformation appears on Airbnb. That said, what I have learned is that the nature of disinformation that appears on Airbnb and other sharing economy platforms is quite distinct in terms of its character. And this is the type of digital content that I have called delusive speech. Now, delusive speech is quite different from other types of harmful content in online communication. Think about it this way. When you stumble across a YouTube video of a homophobic right-wing hater, it's awful when you watch something like that, but you know what you're dealing with. The content creator is a total dweeb and a moron and is spouting a whole bunch of disinformation, but he or she isn't hiding their prejudice. It's obvious and it's in your face and it's awful, but at least it's transparent. The content aims to be mean and nasty, and it is mean and nasty. Delusive speech is far more sinister in its semiotic construction because it deliberately hides its true intent behind kindness. When scammers create content on sharing platforms, they go to extraordinary lengths to appear kind and welcoming and polite and trustworthy. The scam wouldn't work if they didn't do that. So on the surface, everything seems perfectly innocent, but underneath, it's entirely motivated by malice. Also, a key characteristic of delusive speech is that often it is indistinguishable from honest and genuine content. So think about it. When you log on to Airbnb or even booking.com, you type in the destination that you plan to travel to. And then once you've done that, you're presented with a long list of properties that you can then browse through. Some of the properties that you are looking at are probably fake. And some of the properties that you're looking at are real. Can you tell the difference between the fake ones and the real ones? No, of course you can't. They look exactly the same. The key difference here is that disinformation can often be exposed by the person who is looking at it by making synaptic connections to previously learned information or simply by doing some fact checking. But delusive speech looks exactly the same as honest and genuine content. It is indistinguishable, and so it can't be as easily exposed. So I do think about delusive speech as a subset of disinformation because of the way that it deliberately obscures the truth. But the distinction between disinformation and delusive speech isn't just semiotic. There's also a subtle and important difference in intent. So disinformation is all about spreading deliberate lies. But generally, when we study disinformation, we generally look at how it is typically done for political purposes. So you can think of election manipulation or stirring up conflict in between groups. Disinformation is about swaying people over to a particular cause, an ideology, a cultural standpoint, or for a military advantage, which unfortunately we're seeing quite a lot of lately. So disinformation is political, but scammers don't give a damn about your politics. They are only after your money. So while delusive speech shares disinformation's foundational intent of deception, its motivation is completely different. Political actors spread disinformation for ideological gain, but scammers spread delusive speech for one primary goal, and that is crime. So at its heart, delusive speech is criminal speech disguised as kindness. So whenever I give anyone this whole long explanation, everyone always asks me, is there anything that can be done about all this? And so, I mean, the first thing that we always think of is popular education, right? Raising awareness about the scams that are proliferating online. Awareness campaigns are nice, but they're not effective. Many authorities have launched scam literacy programs designed to educate people about the warning signs of scams. But these have shown only limited success, even against traditional scams. And the real problem, remember, that in our age of delusive speech, these educational approaches become virtually useless. How can you teach people to spot the warning signs when there simply are no warning signs to see? So when fake advertisements are indistinguishable from legitimate ones, traditional scam awareness actually becomes irrelevant. The next thing that we think about when we think, well, what can be done about this is law enforcement. Again, I say that's nice, but it's not effective. Ideally, we would love to see massive increases in arrests and prosecutions that would deter scammers entirely, but the reality is far more complicated. The problem with cybercrime is that it's inherently international and transnational. Victims might be in Cape Town or Copenhagen, but the perpetrators could be sitting anywhere in the world. So that creates huge jurisdictional challenges for law enforcement. Even when authorities do want to cooperate across borders, the mechanisms for doing so are very time-consuming and complicated because every country has its own legal system, as it should in terms of its sovereignty. But what that means is that prosecution in this area remains very low. So we're essentially fighting a borderless problem with border-bound solutions. I argue that the best place to try to do something about delusive speech online is by turning our attention directly to big tech platforms. And the best way to minimize delusive speech online is to address it at its source, and that is on the platforms that carry it. That, of course, places the responsibility squarely on big tech companies because they're the only ones who can address the back-end vulnerabilities that allow scammers to enter onto their platforms in the first place. So my research uncovered that there are fundamental weaknesses in many of these platforms that means that they have become massive global carriers for delusive speech. And I documented numerous Airbnb vulnerabilities and how they should be addressed, but many other platforms face the same type of problems. So I'll give you some quick examples. Verification protocols need to be made more effective. I mean, my research tracked exactly how easy it is for scammers to circumvent Airbnb's verification protocols and upload fake property listings using fake identities for the host profiles. Then again, of course, you have to realize that Airbnb does not have a financial incentive to institute watertight verifications. Airbnb earns a booking fee on their platform, whether the property that you are booking is real or fake. So seeing as that is the case, you have to ask yourself, does Airbnb really have a motivation to institute watertight verifications on their platform? Many of these companies also require major internal policy overhauls. And why I say that is because often scammers will use loopholes in community standards or the company's own policy provisions to scam people. And I saw this most markedly on Airbnb when I noticed that scammers were actually abusing Airbnb's flexible cancellation policies to make sure that they received the monies paid by their targets as quickly as possible. And the sad offshoot of that is that often scammed guests can't get a refund, even if they have inadvertently booked a fake property. Also, policy and practice needs to be overhauled within the frameworks of human rights standards. The one instance that I saw this on Airbnb, which is really important, is that Airbnb has a censorship problem. My analysis revealed that Airbnb routinely prevents scammed guests from posting reviews about problematic listings. You cannot publish a negative review on Airbnb. Of course, it would not be in Airbnb's best financial interest to allow negative but honest reviews. Negative reviews obviously would translate to fewer bookings and a reduction in the booking fees earned by the platform. And given that financial incentive, we can't really expect Airbnb to be an objective curator of its own users' reviews. But what this means inadvertently is that all of the most egregious and fraudulent activity on the platform goes unreported. And that then creates a repeating cycle where future guests unwittingly fall victim to the exact same scams as previous guests because the previous guests couldn't warn future guests via the review mechanism. So, of course, Airbnb continues to profit from crime. So Airbnb really needs to overhaul its review system according to human rights frameworks that protect freedom of speech, allowing honest guest experiences to be shared, and to create safer environments where victims can actually warn other future guests of dangerous situations. But perhaps the most frequent complaint that I encountered when I reviewed these 600 cases of crime events was that Airbnb doesn't remove offending listings from its platforms, even after scam guests provide evidence that the listing was posted by a fraudster. So I argue that Airbnb really urgently needs to develop a very swift protocol for removing offending listings to protecting future guests from falling victim to the same scam trap when these are identified. So to conclude, I just want to talk a little bit about why is it important that we start studying delusive speech within the communication and media studies field. And the first reason why I say that's important is because the problem is gargantuan. The true scale of online scams is virtually impossible to measure accurately. The statistics that we do have only represent reported cases. And we know that many victims never come forward because they are embarrassed or they fear victimization. But even knowing that the official statistics are probably too low, these stats are still shocking. So in 2023, 2/3 of Australians were exposed to scams online in just 1 year. That's 66% of the population. South Africa estimates that cybercrime is costing the economy 2.2 billion rand annually. In America, the FTC found that social media scam losses, so those are scams perpetuated on social media platforms, hit a record $2.7 billion in 2021, and it's just increasing since then. The top 3 scam categories in the US were online shopping scams, which include rental scams, making up 44% of all reported cases, followed by investment scams at 20%, and romance scams only at 6%. Now, all 3 of those top scam categories all rely entirely on delusive speech. In 2022, the UK lost £67 million to fake product and holiday rental scams, 114 million to investment fraud, 191 million pounds to impersonation scams. So you're looking at nearly £500 million lost to delusive speech and enabled scams in just one country in just 1 year. And remember, that's only the scams that we know about. The true scale is undoubtedly much higher, which is why understanding delusive speech is becoming so critical. And remember that I've just given you a whole bunch of financial figures, but they only tell half the story. We actually don't have any statistics that accurately tell us the true scale of digitally initiated physical crime. But we know that criminals are using fictitious aliases and delusive speech to do things like setting up fake dating profiles, posting fake job advertisements or fake products for sale, specifically to lure victims to specific locations where they find themselves being robbed or worse. So crimes like robbery, assault, torture, hostage taking, extortion, sextortion, kidnapping and human trafficking, rape and murder have all resulted from criminals initiating contact with targets via digital platforms using delusive speech. So to me, this is perhaps the most chilling aspect of delusive speech, is that it's not just about financial fraud. It's also a gateway to physical harm. And I argue that this is an area of delusive speech-enabled crime that really shouldn't be ignored in future research. The second reason why I say it's important that we start studying delusive speech within the communications and media studies field is because there are many aspects to this that can really only be studied from a communication perspective. So, for example, the field of psychology has spent years trying to determine why people fall for scams, particularly those notorious 419 email scams. And the findings are what you would expect. You know, the studies suggest that the elderly and the socially isolated or less educated are more vulnerable. So, poor decision making, impulsiveness, loneliness, and financial desperation all increase the risk factor, and traditional scams exploit those types of weaknesses. But here's the problem is that none of this applies in sharing economy scams. The entire dynamic has totally shifted in a number of crucial ways. First of all, scammers no longer chase targets. Their victims come to them. Their victims are funneled towards them by these ubiquitous sharing economy platforms. So instead of cold calling or sending a whole bunch of unsolicited emails, scammers simply have to post fake advertisements and they can put their feet up and sit back and wait. They've never had to do so little work to entrap their victims because their victims literally fall into their laps. Secondly, when people respond to ads, we're already primed to spend money. That's the whole point of using these platforms, right? You log on to Amazon to buy something. You browse Airbnb to book and pay for accommodation. We arrive to make a purchase. So scammers don't need to convince us to part with our cash because we are already willing and ready to do so. And thirdly, you don't need to be vulnerable, desperate, or a poor decision maker to fall for these scams. Victims aren't being targeted because of personality flaws. They're just simply going about daily, normal, day-to-day activities like buying products and booking travel. Fake advertisements are indistinguishable from real ones. So you don't see any red flags because there are no red flags to see. So everyone using these platforms is equally vulnerable. The question now is, it isn't why are some people more susceptible to falling for a scam than others. The real question is, why are these platforms so vulnerable to misuse by scammers? And that's where communication studies comes in. So despite this growing problem, research has largely ignored how scams are actually constructed. There's extensive work on consumer fraud generally, but very little attention has been paid to understanding the communication structures of scam relationships, particularly during that very crucial early planning and initial contact phases. Understanding the preliminary phase is really critical because skillfully crafted scams using asymmetric information can really con anyone, regardless of class or education or circumstances. So, to put it another way, it's entirely possible to dupe a perfectly reasonable person with the correct scam design. So, we need to study the scam design. And again, you know, Airbnb isn't the only problem, it's everywhere. And because the architecture of each big tech platform is quite different, delusive speech works differently on each platform and needs to be studied differently depending on the platform that you're looking at. As I said earlier, it's on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, Trustpilot, TripAdvisor. If you can think of an online platform, delusive speech is there. But we can figure out how it works at a technical level. And if we can do that, if we can figure out how it works at a technical level, then we can also figure out how to stop it, even if we can only do that one platform at a time. And there's a third reason why I say it's important that we start studying delusive speech in the communication field, and that is because we are uniquely placed to do so, because we have the methodologies to do it. In the last chapter of my book, I've included some methodological suggestions on how to study delusive speech on other platforms in the future, and I won't summarize all of that here. But in short, I mean, media studies and communication scholars have a long history of conducting participatory and audience research studies, and many of the same research principles can be applied to this problem because who better can explain how scammers scam than the people who have been scammed? So I really feel that it's time for us to start examining the flaws in the technical architecture of big tech platforms that make them vulnerable to misuse by criminals. And then we need to demand that these companies are held to account and develop policy interventions to make the internet safer. Because we're dealing with Scam Incorporated. It's a global dark industry where delusive speech is the primary weapon. And the sharing economy's vulnerability to hosting delusive speech in environments that we are led to believe that we can trust has really given criminals unprecedented opportunities to expand their operations. We desperately need to close the gaps in platform design that exposes all of us to harm. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Silicon Valley's blitzscaling mentality or growth at all costs approach is what has created this mess. When these platforms were first being designed, safety mechanisms should have been foundational priorities. But instead, those priorities were pushed aside in favor of rapid expansion. And a decade later, we are paying the price for those decisions. So, the bitter pill that we might have to swallow is that many of our most popular platforms actually need to be completely rebuilt from the ground up and properly this time. I'm of the view that technology leaders must be made to take responsibility for the consequences of their decisions, and that it's time for big tech to start doing the work to make their platforms genuinely safer. I thank you, and I'll leave it there. Thank you.